The wind tore through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, a biting March gust that carried the faint promise of spring but still stung like winter's last stand. Barron Trump pulled the hood of his black sweatshirt tighter around his broad shoulders, his long legs cutting a steady path through the evening crowd. At 18, he was a freshman at NYU's Stern School of Business, a towering figure who could have been mistaken for just another college kid if not for the two Secret Service agents trailing a few steps behind. His earbuds hummed faintly, maybe Radiohead's melancholic strums or a snippet of a business podcast his father had recommended. But tonight, something else broke through the rhythm of his routine. It was a sound, raw and unrefined, drifting up from the cracked sidewalk beneath a flickering street lamp. A guitar. Barron's steps slowed, then stopped entirely. His sharp blue eyes, inherited from his mother Melania, scanned the scene ahead. There, slumped against a graffiti-stained brick wall, sat a young man, no older than Barron himself. His clothes were a patchwork of desperation, a thin jacket held together with silver duct tape, jeans so faded they looked like they might dissolve in the next rain. In his lap, he cradled an old acoustic guitar, its wood scratched and splintered, its strings dulled with rust. But the music he coaxed from it was alive, a melody that wove through the cold air like a thread of light in a dark room. Barron pulled his earbuds out, letting them dangle around his neck, and listened. The city's chaos, the honking taxis, the chatter of pedestrians rushing home, faded into a dull hum as the notes took over. The guitarist's name was Luke Rivera, though Barron wouldn't know that yet. At 19, Luke was a ghost of the boy he'd once been, a shadow cast by a life that had unraveled too fast. Back in high school, he'd been the star of the music room, his fingers dancing over the strings with a grace that made teachers whisper about scholarships and futures. His dark hair had been neatly combed then, his brown eyes bright with dreams. Now, that hair fell in greasy tangles over his forehead, and those eyes were sunken, dulled by 2 years of sleeping on concrete and eating whatever scraps he could scrounge. His father had lost his job at a Jersey factory when the recession hit. His mother had fallen to cancer, a slow, brutal thief that drained their savings before taking her life. And Luke had dropped out to keep the family afloat. But it hadn't been enough. Now, all he had was this guitar, a battered relic from better days, and a dented coffee cup that sat in front of him, holding a pitiful 87 cents. Luke's fingers moved over the strings, trembling slightly from the cold, or maybe from hunger, he couldn't tell anymore. The melody was one he'd written himself, back when he still believed in tomorrows. It was rough around the edges, the notes stumbling here and there, but it carried a weight that words couldn't touch. He didn't look up much these days. People didn't like meeting his eyes, didn't like seeing the hunger or the shame, but something made him glance tonight. And there he was, a tall figure in a black hoodie, standing still when everyone else rushed past. Luke's heart thudded, a mix of nerves and defiance. He'd seen rich kids before, the kind who tossed a quarter his way with a smirk, or crossed the street to avoid him altogether. But this one didn't move. He just watched. Barron tilted his head slightly, a habit he'd picked up from years of observing his father negotiate deals in boardrooms and his mother navigate crowds with quiet grace. He wasn't sure why he'd stopped. Maybe it was the music, maybe it was the way the kid's hands shook but kept playing anyway. There was something in it that hit him, a chord that echoed somewhere deep, like the Slovenian lullabies his mother used to hum when he was small, or the stories his father told about clawing his way up from nothing. Barron's life had always been cushioned, private schools, penthouses, security details, but he wasn't blind. He saw the duct tape on the kid's jacket, the way it barely held the fabric together against the wind. He saw the coffee cup, the coins glinting faintly in the streetlight like a plea no one answered. And he saw the music, how it rose above the city's noise, fragile but unbroken. One of his Secret Service agents, James, stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking softly on the pavement. "Sir, we should keep moving," he said, his voice low but edged with the urgency of protocol. The city never slept, and neither did their duty to keep Barron safe. The Trump name came with weight, sometimes protection, sometimes a target, and James had seen enough paparazzi swarms to know a quiet walk could turn loud fast. But Barron raised a hand, just a slight lift of his fingers, the kind of gesture his father used to silence a room without raising his voice. "Wait," he said, his tone deep and steady, carrying a quiet authority that didn't need to shout. "Just a minute." James exchanged a quick glance with the other agent, a stocky man named Mike, but they held their positions, their eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. Luke's fingers faltered for a split second when he heard the voice. It wasn't loud, wasn't commanding, but it cut through the wind like it belonged there. He risked another glance, meeting Barron's gaze for a heartbeat before dropping his eyes back to the guitar. Who was this guy? Too tall to be just another student, too calm to be some entitled jerk. Luke's stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble that made him wince, but he pushed through the next chord. He'd learned to ignore the hunger, the way it gnawed at him like a stray dog chewing a bone. If he stopped playing, he might lose the nerve to start again. The music was all he had left, the one thing that still felt like his. Barron took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement, mingling with the faint glow of the street lamp. He wasn't sure what he was doing. His days were structured, classes and study sessions and the occasional call from his father about making it big. But this felt different. He noticed the kids' hands, how they were chapped and red from the cold, how they moved with a kind of stubborn grace despite the trembling. He noticed the guitar, its worn body telling a story of its own, maybe a pawn shop find, maybe a hand-me-down from better days. And he noticed the coffee cup, sitting there like a silent cry for help. 87 cents. Not enough for a coffee, not enough for anything. James shifted behind him, his radio crackling faintly as he adjusted his earpiece. "Sir, your schedule." He started again, but Barron cut him off with a look. Not harsh, not angry, just a steady glance that said he wasn't ready to move. Not yet. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his phone. He didn't pull it out, not yet, but the thought was there, forming like a plan he hadn't fully grasped. Something about this kid, this moment, stuck with him. He didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but he saw the weight he carried, the way he played like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. Luke's mind raced as he stole another glance at the stranger. He'd seen guys like this before, tall, confident, the kind who walked like the world bent to them. But this one didn't toss a coin and walk away. He didn't sneer or preach. He just stood there, listening. Luke's chest tightened. Was this pity? Curiosity? He hated pity, hated the way it made him feel small, but this didn't feel like that. It felt different. His fingers slipped, hitting a sour note, and he cursed under his breath. Keep playing, he told himself. Don't stop. Don't let him see you break. Barron's gaze lingered on the coffee cup, then drifted back to the kid's face. He was young, too young to look so tired, too young to be sitting on a sidewalk with nothing but a guitar and a handful of change. Barron had grown up with everything. Private jets, penthouses, a name that opened doors before he even knocked. But he'd also grown up watching. Watching his father build empires, watching his mother move through life with a quiet strength most people missed. He'd learned to see things others didn't, the cracks beneath the polish, the stories behind the silence. And this kid, whoever he was, had a story. The wind picked up again, whipping a stray newspaper page across the street. It danced past Luke's feet, catching on the edge of his coffee cup for a moment before blowing away. Barron watched it go, his mind turning. He didn't know why this mattered, why this kid, this music, this night, but it did. Maybe it was the way the melody reminded him of his mother's voice, soft and steady in a world that was anything but. Maybe it was the way his father always said, "You see an opportunity, you take it." This didn't feel like an opportunity, not in the way his father meant, but it felt like something. James cleared his throat, louder this time. "Sir, we really need to." "Give me a minute," Barron said, his voice firmer now, though still calm. He wasn't annoyed. He never got annoyed, not outwardly, but he wasn't moving either. James sighed, stepping back, his hand hovering near his radio. Mike, the other agent, shifted his weight, his eyes darting to a group of pedestrians slowing to gawk. The street lamp flickered again, its weak light stuttering over the cracked pavement as the wind whipped through Manhattan's restless veins. Barron Trump stood rooted to the spot, his tall frame casting a long shadow that stretched toward Luke Rivera like an unspoken bridge. The melody from Luke's battered guitar still hung in the air, its notes, fragile but stubborn, refusing to be swallowed by the city's roar. Barron's hand lingered in his pocket, fingers brushing the edge of his phone, his mind racing with a thought he couldn't quite pin down. He didn't know this kid, didn't know his name or his story, but the music, it was like a crack in the wall, letting something real seep through. Luke's fingers slowed, the last chord fading into the night as he shifted uncomfortably under Barron's steady gaze. He wasn't used to this, people stopping, people listening. Most days, he was just background noise, a blur of sound and desperation that New Yorkers stepped around without a second thought. His coffee cup sat there, dented and pitiful, the 87 cents inside rattling faintly as the wind nudged it. He pulled his knees closer, the duct-tape jacket creaking as he moved, and risked another glance at the tall stranger. Who was this guy? Why hadn't he walked away yet? Luke's stomach growled again, a low, insistent ache, but he swallowed it down, his pride a jagged thing he couldn't let go of. Barron's Secret Service agent, James, shifted his weight, his polished shoes scraping the sidewalk. "Sir, we really need to move," he said, his tone tighter now, laced with the kind of urgency that came from years of protocol. The Trump name was a magnet, sometimes for cameras, sometimes for trouble, and James knew a quiet moment could turn into a circus in seconds. Mike, the other agent, kept his eyes on the growing knot of onlookers, their phones already out, catching glints of light as they angled for a shot. But Barron didn't budge. "One more minute," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that didn't invite argument. James sighed, muttering something into his radio, while Mike adjusted his stance, his broad shoulders a silent barrier against the curious crowd. Luke's hands rested on the guitar, his chapped fingers tracing the worn wood absent-mindedly. He didn't know what to make of this. Didn't know why this guy cared, if he even did. Maybe he was just another rich kid looking for a story to tell, something to laugh about later over drinks Barron could probably afford without blinking. But there was no smirk, no arrogance in the way he stood there. Just stillness. Luke's mind drifted, unbidden, to a memory he tried to keep buried. 2 years ago, before the streets, before the hunger, he'd played this same guitar in a high school auditorium. The lights had been bright, the crowd had clapped, his mom had been there, her frail hands trembling as she applauded, her smile wide despite the chemo stealing her strength. That was the last time anyone had really listened. Barron noticed the shift, the way the kid's shoulders slumped a little more, the way his eyes clouded with something heavier than exhaustion. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror sometimes, when the weight of his last name pressed too hard. Growing up, Trump meant private jets and penthouses, sure, but it also meant eyes, always watching, always judging. He'd learned to hide, to keep his thoughts behind a wall of silence. But this kid didn't have that luxury. Whatever he was carrying, it was raw, spilling out in the music like blood from a fresh cut. Barron's fingers tightened around his phone. He didn't know why it mattered, why this mattered, but it did. Luke cleared his throat, a rough sound that broke the silence. "You gonna stand there all night?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse, tinged with a defiance he didn't fully feel. He didn't mean to sound rude, didn't want to scare off whatever this was, but the words slipped out anyway. Barron didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, his tone even, almost playful, though his face stayed serious. Luke blinked, caught off guard. Was this guy messing with him? He shifted the guitar in his lap, his fingers itching to play again, if only to fill the awkward quiet. Barron took a step closer, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. The crowd murmured, a low buzz of speculation, but he ignored it. He crouched down, bringing himself to Luke's level, his long frame folding with a grace that didn't match his height. James tensed, his hand twitching toward his earpiece, but Barron waved him off without looking back. "What's that song?" Barron asked, nodding at the guitar. His voice was soft, not demanding, but there was a curiosity in it that made Luke pause. "It's mine," Luke said, hesitating. He wasn't used to talking about it. Wasn't used to talking at all, not anymore. "Wrote it a while back." He shrugged, like it didn't matter, but his grip tightened on the guitar. Barron tilted his head, studying him. "It's good," he said simply, no trace of condescension. Luke's chest tightened. "Good?" He hadn't heard that word in years. Not about his music, not about anything. He muttered a quick, "Thanks," his eyes dropping to the coffee cup, the coins mocking him with their silence. Barron straightened up, his shadow shifting over Luke again. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched as Luke's fingers brushed the strings, coaxing out a faint, tentative note. The kid was talented, raw, unpolished, but talented. Barron had grown up around polished things, polished people, polished deals, but this was different. This was real. He thought of his father, the way Donald Trump could spot potential in a crumbling building and turn it into gold. But this wasn't a building. This was a person, someone the world had overlooked. And Barron, for all his quiet, saw it. Luke's mind spun. Why was this guy still here? What did he want? He'd had people stop before, drunk tourists tossing $1, preachers offering prayers he didn't need, but this felt different. He remembered his mom's voice, weak but steady, after that last concert. "You've got a gift, Lucas. Don't let it go." He hadn't let it go, not completely, but it was slipping, fading with every cold night, every empty day. His fingers moved again, starting the melody over, softer this time, like a whisper he wasn't sure he wanted heard. Barron pulled his phone out now, his thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't open it, not yet, but the idea was solidifying, a spark turning into a flame. He'd seen his father make calls that changed lives. Deals closed, projects launched, but this wasn't about money or power. This was about the music, about the kid playing it. "You play every night?" Barron asked, his voice cutting through the wind. Luke nodded, slow and wary. "Most nights. When it's not raining." Barron's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Good to know," he said, cryptic enough to make Luke frown. James stepped forward again, his patience thinning. "Sir, we're late." "Your father." "I heard you," Barron said, sharper this time, though his eyes stayed on Luke. He softened it with a nod. "We're going. Soon." James backed off, muttering into his radio, while Mike shot a glance at the crowd, now a dozen strong, their phones glinting like fireflies. Barron didn't care. He crouched again, closer now, his voice low. "Keep playing," he said, not a command but something else, something like a promise. "Someone's gonna hear you." Luke's breath caught. What did that mean? He didn't ask, didn't know how, but the words stuck with him, heavy and strange. Barron stood, slipping his phone back into his pocket, and turned to walk away. James and Mike fell into step behind him, their presence a silent shield. Luke watched him go, the tall figure disappearing into the crowd, the melody still echoing in his hands. He didn't know who that guy was, didn't know why he'd stopped, but for the first time in months, he felt seen. Barron didn't look back, but his mind was already moving. The kid's music, it wasn't just good, it was something more. Something worth hearing. He pulled his phone out again as he walked, his thumb swiping to the camera app. Not tonight, he thought. But soon. He'd be back. And when he was, he'd make sure the world heard what he'd heard. The Manhattan skyline glittered against the darkening sky, its jagged edges slicing through the last traces of daylight as Barron Trump made his way back to the same cracked sidewalk. It was the next evening, the air still sharp with March's lingering chill, but tonight he moved with purpose. His black hoodie was swapped for a dark jacket, the kind that blended into the crowd but couldn't quite hide his height or the quiet confidence in his stride. The Secret Service agents, James and Mike, trailed behind as always, their presence a familiar shadow, though Barron had made it clear, this wasn't a night for interruptions. In his pocket, his phone felt heavier than usual, its camera app a tool he hadn't used much until now. He'd heard the music last night, and it hadn't left him. Tonight, he'd made sure it didn't leave the world either. Luke Rivera was there again, hunched against the same graffiti-stained wall, his battered guitar cradled in his lap like a lifeline. The street lamp above buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over his patched jacket, and the coffee cup that sat in front of him, still dented, still holding a meager handful of coins. He didn't notice Barron at first, his eyes fixed on the strings as his fingers moved through the same melody, softer now, like he was too tired to give it everything. The notes trembled in the cold air, fragile but alive, a whisper of the kid he used to be. Luke's mind was elsewhere, back in Jersey, in a cramped living room where his mom used to sit, her chemo-thinned hair hidden under a scarf, her voice weak but warm. "Play it again, Lucas," she'd say, smiling through the pain. He'd lost her a year ago, and with her, the last piece of home. Barron stopped a few feet away, blending into the edge of the passing crowd. He didn't crouch this time, didn't want to spook the kid, not yet. He pulled his phone out, his thumbs swiping to the camera app with a practiced ease. The screen lit up, and he adjusted the angle, framing Luke against the wall, the guitar's worn wood catching the street lamp's light. James stepped closer, his voice a low murmur. "Sir, what are you doing?" Barron didn't look up. "Recording," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for debate. James hesitated, his hand twitching toward his earpiece. But Mike gave him a subtle nod, let the kid do his thing. Luke's fingers faltered when he caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He glanced up, and there he was again, the tall stranger from last night, the one who'd stopped when no one else had. Only now, he was holding a phone, its screen glowing faintly in the dusk. Luke's stomach dropped. Was this some kind of prank? A rich kid filming this street rat for laughs? His grip tightened on the guitar, his voice rough as he muttered, "What's your deal, man?" The words came out sharper than he meant, a shield against whatever this was. Barron lowered the phone slightly, meeting Luke's gaze. "I told you," he said, calm and steady. "Someone's gonna hear you." Luke blinked, the defiance in his chest warring with confusion. "Hear me?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. He shifted on the cold pavement, the duct tape on his jacket creaking. "What, you some kind of scout or something?" Barron's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Not exactly," he said, cryptic as ever. He raised the phone again, hitting record. The red dot blinked on the screen, and Luke froze, his fingers hovering over the strings. "Just play," Barron said, his voice soft but firm, the kind of tone that didn't push but somehow pulled you along. Luke's throat tightened. He didn't get it, didn't get this guy, didn't get why he cared, but the way he said it, like it mattered, made something shift. He took a shaky breath, his chapped hand settling back on the guitar. The first note was hesitant, a quiet pluck that barely carried over the wind, but then he found the rhythm. The melody spilled out, raw and unpolished, the same one he'd played last night, the one he'd written for his mom, back when she still believed he'd make it. His eyes drifted shut, the world shrinking to just him and the strings, the music pulling him somewhere he hadn't been in years. Barron watched through the screen, the phone steady in his hands. The kid was good, better than good. The melody wasn't perfect, wasn't trained, but it had soul, the kind of sound that hit you in the chest and stayed there. He'd grown up around polish, his father's brash speeches, his mother's elegant poise, but this was different. This was real, unfiltered, like the kid was bleeding through the notes. The crowd slowed, a few pedestrians pausing to listen, their phones joining Barron's in a quiet chorus of curiosity. James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the growing attention, but Barron didn't flinch. He kept recording, his focus locked on Luke. Luke didn't see the crowd, didn't want to. He was back in that Jersey living room, his mom's smile lighting up the dim space, his dad nodding along from the couch. They believed in him, back when he believed in himself. The cancer had taken her slow, the bills had taken everything else, and Luke had ended up here, alone, cold, invisible. But now, with this stranger watching, recording, he felt something. Not hope, not yet, just a crack in the numbness, a flicker of what used to be. His fingers moved faster, the melody building, his breath hitching as he pushed through the ache in his hands. Barron's thumb hovered over the stop button, but he didn't press it, not yet. He let the kid play, let the music fill the space between them. He didn't know where this was going, didn't have a full plan, but he knew one thing: this sound deserved more than a sidewalk and a coffee cup. He'd seen his father turn nothing into something, empty lots into towers, ideas into empires. But this wasn't about money. This was about the kid, about the music, about a chance no one else had given him. Luke's eyes opened as the last note faded, his chest heaving slightly. He looked up, meeting Barron's gaze, and saw the phone still recording. "You done?" he asked, his voice rough but curious now, the edge softened. Barron nodded, hitting stop. The screen went dark, but he didn't put the phone away. "For now," he said, his tone carrying that same quiet promise from last night. Luke frowned, unsure what to make of it. "What's that supposed to mean?" he pressed, his fingers resting on the strings. Barron straightened, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Means I'll be back," he said, simple and direct. He glanced at the coffee cup, still 87 cents, untouched, and then back at Luke. "Keep playing." Luke's mouth opened, a question forming, but Barron was already turning away, James and Mike falling into step behind him. The crowd murmured, a few phones still pointed their way, but Barron didn't look back. His mind was racing, the video burning a hole in his pocket. He didn't know the kid's story, not yet, but he'd heard enough to know it wasn't over. Luke watched him go, the tall figure disappearing into the sea of people, the melody still echoing in his hands. He didn't understand, didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted, but for the second night in a row, he felt seen. His fingers brushed the strings again, a single note slipping out, soft and uncertain. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a fluke. But as the wind carried that note away, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something big, was starting. Barron didn't stop until he was a block away, the agent's footsteps a steady rhythm behind him. He pulled his phone out, opening the video. The sound was rough, the wind cutting through, but the music, it was there, clear and raw. He swiped to his contacts, his thumb pausing over a name. Not his father, not yet. Someone else, someone who'd know what to do with this. He didn't hit call, not tonight, but the idea was solid now, a plan taking shape. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, the world would hear. The Trump Tower penthouse glowed against the Manhattan night, its golden lights a stark contrast to the cold streets below. Barron Trump sat on the edge of a leather couch, his long legs stretched out, his phone resting on the glass coffee table in front of him. The screen was dark now, but the video, the raw, trembling melody of that kid on the sidewalk, was still fresh in his mind. He'd watched it 3 times since getting home last night, each time hearing something new in the notes. A quiet defiance, a buried hope. Barron was used to plans, his father's big, brash ones, his mother's careful, elegant ones, but this was his. Small, unformed, but his. And tonight, he'd take the first step. Downstairs, in the shadow of skyscrapers, Luke Rivera shivered against the same brick wall, his guitar silent for once. The day had been brutal, rain in the morning, a cop shooing him off his usual spot in the afternoon, and barely $1 in his coffee cup by dusk. He'd moved back to the street lamp corner after dark, but his fingers were too stiff to play, his stomach too empty to care. The duct-tape jacket hung loose on his frame, the patches peeling from the damp, and he pulled it tighter, a futile shield against the wind. He didn't know about the video, didn't know about the tall stranger's plans. All he knew was the cold, the hunger, and the memory of those 2 nights when someone had stopped to listen. Barron leaned forward, picking up his phone. The penthouse was quiet. His father was in D.C., his mother somewhere in the apartment, her soft footsteps a distant comfort. He swiped to the video, the thumbnail showing Luke hunched over his guitar, the street lamp casting a halo around him. Barron's thumb hovered over the share button, his mind briefly considering Instagram or X, but he shook his head. This wasn't about quick likes or fleeting trends. This was about the music, about giving it a real stage. He scrolled to his contacts instead, landing on a name, Ethan Carter. A friend from Stern, a sophomore who ran a YouTube channel with a decent following, mostly music reviews and indie finds. If anyone could get this out there, it was him. Luke shifted on the pavement, his breath fogging in the chilly air. He hadn't played since last night, not really. The stranger's words, "Someone's gonna hear you," kept circling in his head, nagging at him like a song he couldn't finish. Who was that guy? Why'd he care? Luke had seen plenty of widows in 2 years on the street, preachers, drunks, do-gooders with pamphlets, but none like him. Tall, quiet, with eyes that saw too much. Luke's fingers brushed the guitar strings, a faint note slipping out, but he stopped. What was the point? No one cared, not really. That guy was probably just some rich kid with a savior complex, gone back to his cushy life by now. Barron hit Ethan's number, the call ringing twice before a voice picked up. "Yo, Barron, what's up?" Ethan's tone was casual, a little surprised. Barron wasn't the type to call out of the blue. "I've got something," Barron said, skipping the small talk. "A video. You need to see it." Ethan laughed, half joking. "What, you making vlogs now? Trump Tower exclusives?" Barron didn't bite. "It's a guy. Street musician. He's good, really good. Can you put it on your YouTube channel?" There was a pause, then Ethan's voice sharpened, intrigued. "Send it over. I'll check it out." Barron nodded to himself, attaching the video and hitting send. "No edits," he added. "Just raw. Put it up as is." Luke pulled his knees up, resting the guitar against them. The coffee cup sat there, mocking him with its emptiness. $1.12 now, after a kid tossed a quarter earlier. He thought about the soup kitchen on 42nd, but it was too far, and his legs felt like lead. His mind drifted again, back to Jersey, to the night his mom died. She'd been in hospice by then, her voice barely a whisper. "You're gonna make it, Lucas," she'd said, her hand cold in his. He'd played for her that night, the same melody he'd played for the stranger, until her breathing stopped. He hadn't made it, not yet, but he'd kept the guitar. It was all he had left of her, of them. Barron's phone buzzed a minute later, Ethan's name lighting up the screen. "Dude," Ethan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "This is insane. Rough, but it's got heart. Who is this guy?" Barron leaned back, his eyes on the city skyline. "Don't know," he said. "Just some kid on the street." Ethan whistled. "Well, he's got something. I'll upload it tonight, raw like he said. My subscribers love this. You want your name on it?" Barron shook his head, though Ethan couldn't see it. "No. Keep me out of it." Ethan chuckled. "Mystery uploader, huh? Fine. It'll be live in an hour." Luke didn't hear the call, didn't see the gears turning. He was too busy staring at the pavement, the cracks blurring as his eyes burned, not from tears, not yet, just exhaustion. He thought about the stranger again, the way he'd crouched down, the way he'd listened. "Keep playing," he'd said. Luke snorted under his breath, a bitter sound. "Playing for what? A bug? A pat on the head?" He picked up the guitar anyway, his fingers stiff but moving, the melody creeping out like a reflex. A couple walking by slowed, one of them dropping a dime into the cup. Luke didn't look up. He didn't know it yet, but that melody, the one he'd written for his mom, was about to leave this sidewalk. Barron set his phone down, the screen dark again. He stood, crossing to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling out below like a map of possibilities. Ethan's YouTube channel wasn't massive, maybe 50,000 subscribers, but it was a start. He didn't know what would happen, didn't know if the kid would ever find out, but he'd done something. His father's voice echoed in his head. "You see potential, you move on it." This wasn't a deal, wasn't a tower, but it was potential. Barron's kind of potential. He glanced back at his phone, a flicker of anticipation in his chest. Tomorrow, he'd check. Tomorrow, he'd see. Luke finished the song, the last notes swallowed by the wind. He set the guitar down, his hands shaking, Not just from the cold now, but something else. He didn't know why he kept playing, didn't know why that stranger's words wouldn't leave him alone. A man in a suit hurried past, tossing a crumpled dollar into the cup without breaking stride. Luke stared at it, the paper fluttering against the coins. $2.12. Better than nothing. He pulled the guitar closer, his breath fogging in the air, and wondered, not for the first time, who that tall kid was. Across town, Barron's phone buzzed again. Ethan, with a text. Uploaded. Links live. This guy's gonna hit hard. Barron didn't reply, just opened the link. There it was, the video, unedited, the kid's music cutting through the street noise like a beacon on Ethan's YouTube channel. The title read, Raw Talent Found on NYC Streets. Who is he? Barron's lips twitched, a rare hint of a smile. He didn't know who the kid was, not yet, but someone would. And when they did, the world would hear what he'd heard. Luke leaned back against the wall, the cold seeping through his jacket. He didn't know it yet, didn't feel the shift, but the gears were turning. His music, his mom's song, was out there now, rippling beyond the sidewalk, beyond the coffee cup. And Barron, standing high above the city, knew it was just the beginning. Morning light spilled over Manhattan, a weak sun struggling through the gray haze, painting long shadows across the city's restless streets. Barron Trump woke early in the Trump Tower penthouse, the vast space cloaked in its usual stillness, his father away in D.C., his mother's presence a faint murmur down the hall. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, its screen flickering to life with a soft buzz of notifications. Ethan's text from last night. Uploaded. Links live. This guy's gonna hit hard. Sat unanswered, but new messages had piled up. Barron's eyes narrowed, his breath catching for a moment as he opened YouTube. There it was, on Ethan's channel, the title unchanged. Raw Talent Found on NYC Streets. Who is he? Views, 12,347. Comments, 189. Barron's lips twitch, not quite a smile, but close. Blocks away, under the dim glow of a street lamp, Luke Rivera stirred from a restless night. He'd slept, or tried to, in a subway entrance, his guitar clutched to his chest, the wind whistling through the concrete tunnels like a mournful tune. Sleep hadn't come, just fitful dozes interrupted by every siren, every footstep. His duct-tape jacket was damp and stiff, heavy with morning dew, and he pulled it tighter as he sat up, his bones aching from the cold. The coffee cup was still in his hand, its $2.12 untouched through the night. Luke rubbed his eyes, the stranger's words, tall kid, quiet voice, looping in his mind. Keep playing. He didn't know why they stuck, but they did, clinging like the rust on his guitar strings. Barron tapped the video, keeping the volume low. Luke's music filled the room, raw, shaky notes cut by the wind, but still powerful. He scrolled through the comments. This guy's got soul, one read. Where is he? Someone find him, said another. Hauntingly beautiful, a third added, followed by heart emojis. Barron's eyebrows lifted. 12,000 views in 12 hours, fast, even for Ethan's channel. His thumb paused on a comment. Sounds like he's near Times Square. Check the street signs in the back. Barron froze the video, zooming in. A blurry sign, but legible. West 46th Street. He didn't know exactly where Luke was, but this was a clue, close enough to NYU to check later. Luke dragged himself out of the subway entrance, stepping into the morning rush. Commuters, tourists, all lost in their own worlds. He set the coffee cup on the sidewalk, a faint hope for spare change, and started playing. The melody rose slowly, his mom's song, every note etched into his muscle memory. A woman paused, coffee cup in hand, listening for a few seconds before tossing $1 into his cup. Luke nodded slightly, mumbled, "Thanks," but kept his eyes down. He had no idea, couldn't know, that the same melody was echoing in thousands of ears, miles away, on screens he never touched. Barron held his phone, crossing to the window. The city stretched out below, streets filling with cars, but his mind was back on that sidewalk, with that kid and his guitar. He fired off a text to Ethan. Views are climbing. Keep it up. The reply came fast. Bro, this is nuts. 15K now. People are sharing it like crazy. You sure you don't want credit? Barron didn't respond. Credit wasn't his thing. His father's voice rang in his head. You don't need to be loud to win. Barron wasn't winning loud. He was building something quietly, even if he didn't fully know what yet. Luke's cup clinked as a nickel dropped in, a sharp sound cutting through his thoughts. He glanced up, a young guy with a backpack, grinning. Nice tune, he said, walking off. Luke shrugged, looking at $2.87. Not enough, not even for a sandwich, but it was something. He kept playing, the melody picking up, his fingers warming despite the chill. The crowd flowed past, most ignoring him, but a few slowed, a few listened. Luke didn't notice, couldn't notice, but the air felt different today. People were looking, really looking, some pulling out phones to snap quick clips. A girl murmured to her friend, "This sounds familiar," but Luke didn't hear. Barron refreshed Ethan's channel, 16,892 views. The comments were piling up. Is this near Midtown? Someone get this guy a record deal. His guitar's trashed, but damn, he can play. Barron's thoughts drifted to Luke. Was he still out there, still playing? West 46th Street wasn't far from NYU. Maybe after class he'd swing by. He slipped his phone into his pocket, grabbed his jacket. His father had taught him one thing: if you start something, you see it through. And Barron had started this. Now he wanted to see where it led. Luke's melody swelled, briefly overpowering the wind. A scruffy man in a worn coat stopped, dropped 50 cents into the cup, and rasped, "Keep it up, kid," his voice rough but genuine. Luke looked up, startled. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing at $3.37. He never made this much in a morning. Something was off. He could feel it, but he couldn't place it. He gripped the guitar tighter, his mom's voice echoing in his head. "You've got a gift, Lucas." Maybe it was still there, buried somewhere beneath the cold and the hunger. Barron stepped out of Trump Tower, James and Mike falling in behind him as always. He headed toward NYU, but his mind wasn't on lectures. He pulled out his phone, another text from Ethan. 20K. Bro, this is viral territory. People are asking for more. Barron paused, the city's noise washing over him. 20,000 people. Luke's music had reached 20,000. The kid didn't know, not yet, but Barron did. And that was his quiet victory. Luke finished the song, the final note hanging in the air. He stared at the cup, $3.37, and for the first time that day, a tiny spark of something flickered in his chest. Not hope, not quite, but close. He didn't know, couldn't know, that a video was spinning on YouTube, his video, pulling him out of invisibility with every view, every comment. Barron's plan was working, and Luke, without realizing it, was at the heart of it. The afternoon sun hung low over Manhattan, its light filtering through the steel and glass jungle, casting a faint warmth over the city's restless pulse. Barron Trump sat in a corner of the NYU library, his laptop open to Ethan's YouTube channel, the video still pinned at the top. Raw talent found on NYC streets. Who is he? Views had climbed to 47,621, comments spilling past 500. Barron scrolled through them, his sharp eyes scanning the words. This guy's a hidden gem. Anyone know where he plays? His music stuck in my head. Need more. The numbers weren't massive, not yet, but they were growing, spreading like ripples on a still pond. Barron leaned back, his fingers tapping the table, a rare flicker of satisfaction in his chest. This was moving faster than he'd expected. Blocks away, under the same street lamp on West 46th Street, Luke Rivera sat with his guitar, the battered instrument resting across his knees. The morning's $3.37 had turned into $5.92 by noon. Quarters, dimes, a few crumpled bills tossed by strangers who lingered longer than usual. Luke didn't get it. People weren't just passing by anymore. They were stopping, listening, some even smiling. A teenage girl had snapped a photo earlier, giggling with her friend about that guitarist. And a guy in a hoodie had filmed him for a solid minute before dropping $1. Luke's stomach still growled. He'd splurged on a $2 hot dog, his first real food in days. But the unease was louder. Something was off, and he couldn't shake it. Barron closed his laptop, slipping it into his backpack. Ethan had texted again. 60K views now. People are obsessed. Someone's calling him the street Bard. You sure you don't want in on this? Barron didn't reply, not yet. He stood, pulling on his jacket, his mind already on West 46th Street. The library's hum faded as he stepped outside, James and Mike falling into step behind him. He'd skipped his last class. Finance 101 could wait. He needed to see if the kid was still there, still playing. His father's voice echoed. You start something, you finish it. Barron wasn't sure what the finish line looked like, but he wasn't stopping now. Luke plucked a tentative note, the melody, his mom's song, slipping out like a reflex. The crowd was thicker today, the usual rush of commuters and tourists slowing around him. A woman in a business suit dropped a $5 bill into his cup, her heels clicking as she walked off with a quiet, "Beautiful." Luke stared at the money. $10.92 now, his breath catching. That was more than he made in a week, let alone a day. His fingers faltered, the note souring, and he muttered a curse under his breath. What was going on? He glanced around, catching eyes that didn't look away, people watching, whispering, pointing. A kid with a skateboard said, "Yo, you're that guy, right?" Luke frowned. "What guy?" The kid shrugged, rolling off. "Dunno, just heard about you." Barron turned onto W46, the street buzzing with its usual chaos. Vendors hawking pretzels, cabs honking, a street preacher shouting about salvation. He spotted Luke from a distance, the familiar slump of his shoulders, the duct-tape jacket peeling at the seams. The guitar was in his hands, the melody rising over the noise, same as before but stronger now, like the kid had found a spark. Barron slowed, blending into the crowd, his height making it hard to stay unnoticed. James murmured, "Sir, you sure about this?" Barron nodded, his voice low. "Just watching." Mike scanned the growing cluster of onlookers, phones out, voices overlapping. Something was building here. Luke's fingers moved faster, the music pulling him in despite the confusion. He didn't understand, didn't know why the cup was heavier, why the stares were sharper, but it felt different. His mom's voice crept into his head. "You've got a gift, Lucas." He'd buried that gift under 2 years of cold nights and empty days, but now it was clawing its way back. A man in a beanie tossed $1, saying, "Saw you online, man, keep it up." Luke's hands froze mid-chord. "Online?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The man nodded, already walking away. "Yeah, YouTube. You're blowing up." Luke's stomach dropped, his eyes darting to the cup. $11.92, like it held answers he didn't have. Barron watched from across the street, his hands in his pockets, his breath steady. The kid looked rattled, good, he was starting to feel it. The crowd was bigger now, a dozen people lingering, some filming, some just listening. Barron pulled out his phone, refreshing the video, 68,392 views. A new comment caught his eye. "Found him. W46 near 8th Avenue. Go see this guy live." Barron's pulse quickened. People were coming, really coming. He glanced at Luke, saw the confusion in his hunched shoulders, the way his fingers hesitated over the strings. The kid didn't know yet, but he would soon. Luke started playing again, the melody shaky at first, then steadying. YouTube? Online? His mind raced. He didn't have a phone, didn't have internet, didn't have anything but this guitar and a coffee cup. How? Who? The tall stranger flashed in his memory, those quiet words, that steady gaze. "Someone's gonna hear you." Luke's chest tightened. Was it him? Had he done this? A woman with a stroller paused, dropping $2 into the cup, her kid clapping. "You're famous," she said, laughing. Luke's eyes widened. $13.92, and he muttered, "I'm not." But the words died. Famous? Him? Barron stepped closer, staying on the edge of the crowd. James and Mike hovered, their presence a silent wall, but Barron waved them back. He didn't want to spook the kid, not yet. He watched Luke play, the melody cutting through the street noise, raw and real. The video had done its job. People were hearing, people were coming. Barron's phone buzzed. Ethan again. $75K. Bro, this is a movement. What's next? Barron didn't know, not exactly, but he felt it, the pull of something bigger. His father built towers. Barron was building this, whatever it was. Luke finished the song, the last note fading into the chatter. He stared at the cup, $13.92, then at the faces around him, more than he'd ever seen. A girl with headphones said, "You're the street bard, right? From YouTube?" Luke's throat closed. "The what?" he croaked. She grinned, showing her phone, a blurry thumbnail, his face, his guitar. "This is you. Everyone's talking about it." Luke's hands shook, the guitar slipping in his lap. He didn't understand, couldn't understand, but the proof was there, in her hand, in the crowd, in the money piling up. Barron saw the moment it hit, the kid's eyes widening, his breath hitching. He stayed back, his face shadowed under his hood, but his lips twitched again. The street bard. Not bad. He turned away, James and Mike following, disappearing into the flow of the city. Luke didn't see him, not yet, but Barron knew he'd be back. The video was out there, the music was alive, and the kid was waking up. This wasn't the end, it was the edge of something new. Twilight settled over Manhattan, the city's lights flickering to life like stars against the concrete sky. Barron Trump leaned against the window of his Trump Tower bedroom, his phone glowing in his hand. Ethan's YouTube channel stared back at him. Raw talent found on NYC streets. Who is he? Views had surged past 112,000, comments flooding in at 1,200 and counting. "The street bard's a legend already," one read. "Someone sign this guy," said another. W46, going tomorrow. Barron's fingers stilled on the screen, his sharp eyes narrowing. The kid, Luke, wasn't just a ripple anymore. He was a wave, and it was growing. Barron felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as possibility. Down on West 46th Street, Luke Rivera sat under the street lamp, his guitar trembling in his hands. The coffee cup overflowed, $27.43, coins spilling onto the pavement, bills crumpled and damp from the day's drizzle. The crowd had swelled all afternoon, dozens now, not just passers-by but people who'd come looking for him. Phones pointed his way, voices overlapped. "It's him. Play that song. You're the street bard." Luke's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He played his mom's melody 5 times in a row, each note heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop. They wouldn't let him. He didn't understand, didn't know how this happened, but the proof was in their eyes, their hands, the money piling up like a dream he couldn't wake from. Barron swiped to Ethan's latest text. 150K views. People are losing it. Someone's starting a GoFundMe for him. What's your next move? Barron didn't answer, not yet. He set the phone down, crossing to his desk, where a notebook lay open. He wasn't his father, sketching towers in gold ink, or his mother, weaving elegance into every step. He was Barron, quiet, deliberate, and this was his project. He jotted a few words. Find him. Help him. No name. The kid didn't need to know who'd started this, not yet, but Barron needed to do more. He grabbed his jacket, a plan forming, sharp and clear. Luke's fingers slipped, a sour note cutting through the melody. The crowd didn't care, they clapped anyway, a ragged cheer rising. Street bard. Street bard. They chanted, and Luke flinched, his stomach twisting. Famous? Him? 2 days ago, he'd been invisible. 2 years ago, he'd been nothing. He thought of his mom, her frail hands clapping in that Jersey hospice room, her voice whispering, "You're gonna make it." Was this making it? He didn't feel made, just exposed raw like a nerve laid bare. A guy in a leather jacket tossed a 5, saying, "Saw you on YouTube, keep rocking, man." Luke's voice cracked as he muttered, "Thanks." His eyes darting to the cup, $32.43. Too much, too fast. Barron stepped onto W46, the street alive with evening bustle. James and Mike trailed him, their steps clipped, their eyes scanning the growing chaos. The crowd around Luke was thick now, maybe 30 people, phones flashing, voices buzzing. Barron stayed back, his hood up, blending into the shadows of a storefront. He saw Luke, head down, shoulders hunched, playing like his life depended on it. The melody hit Barron again, same as that first night, raw, real, unstoppable. He pulled out his phone, refreshing the video, 167,892 views. A new comment. "He's live right now, W46. Get there." Barron's pulse quickened. This was his doing, and it was spiraling. Luke's hands shook as he finished the song, the last notes swallowed by applause. He looked up, dazed, faces blurring into a wall of expectation. A girl with purple hair shoved a phone in his face, his guitar, that YouTube thumbnail. "You're blowing out," she squealed. "How's it feel?" Luke's mouth opened, but nothing came out. How did it feel? Like drowning, like flying, like losing something he couldn't name. "I don't." He started, his voice lost in the noise. A man pushed through, dropping a $10.42.43, and shouted, "Play it again, Bard." Luke gripped the guitar, his knuckles white. He didn't want to, not again. But he did, the melody spilling out like blood. Barron watched, his breath steady, his mind racing. The kid was crumbling. He could see it in the way his shoulders shook, the way his eyes darted like a trapped animal. This wasn't what Barron had meant, not chaos, not a circus. He'd wanted the music heard, not the kid broken. He stepped closer, the crowd parting slightly, James and Mike tense behind him. Luke didn't see him, not yet, but Barron saw everything, the money, the phones, the weight crushing him. His father's voice cut through. "Fix what you start." Barron didn't know how, not yet, but he knew he had to. Luke's melody faltered, his fingers numb. The crowd cheered anyway, louder now, and he winced, the sound hammering his skull. A woman with a notepad pushed forward, press, maybe, asking, "What's your name? Where'd you come from?" Luke's throat closed. "Luke," he rasped, barely audible. "Just look." She scribbled it down, grinning. Luke the street bard, perfect. He wanted to run, wanted to grab his guitar and disappear, but his legs wouldn't move. The cup hit $47.43, a 20 landing on top, and he stared at it, dizzy. Who did this? How? That tall kid's face flashed again, those words, that promise. Barron was close now, just a few feet away, hidden in the crowd's edge. He saw Luke say his name, Luke, and filed it away. Luke Rivera, maybe, if the rumors online were right. He saw the panic in his eyes, the way he clutched the guitar like a shield. Barron's phone buzzed. "Ethan. $200K. GoFundMe said $5,000. People want to save him." Barron's jaw tightened. Save him? The kid didn't need saving, he needed a chance. He turned to James, his voice low. "Get me closer." "Not too close." James nodded, easing them forward, Mike clearing a subtle path. Luke started the melody again, his hands moving on autopilot. The crowd swayed, some singing along. How did they know it? And he felt sick, trapped. He didn't see Barron, not yet, but he felt something shift, a shadow in the chaos. He looked up, eyes scanning, and for a split second, their gazes nearly locked, Barron steady, Luke's wild. But a flash from a phone broke it, blinding him, and Barron stepped back, melting into the throng. Barron's heart thudded, a rare crack in his calm. He'd been seen, almost. He pulled his hood lower, turning away, James and Mike flanking him. The video was at 210,000 views now, the GoFundMe climbing. Luke didn't know who he was, Not yet, but Barron knew him. And he knew this wasn't over. He'd started this fire. Now he had to guide it. Luke finished, the crowd roaring, the cups spilling over, $50 and change. He stared at it, then at the faces, the phones, the chaos. The street bard. They called him, but he didn't feel like a bard, just a kid with a guitar, lost in a storm he hadn't made. And somewhere in that storm, Barron watched, planning, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. Night draped Manhattan in a restless glow, the city's hum unbroken even as the stars hid behind a haze of light pollution. Barron Trump stood in his Trump Tower bedroom, the faint buzz of his phone cutting through the silence. Ethan's YouTube channel blazed on the screen. Raw talent found on NYC streets. Who is he? Views had soared past 350,000, comments a chaotic flood, 3,000 and rising. The street bard's our hero. GoFundMe's at $12,000, save this guy. Luke's the real deal. Barron's jaw tightened, his sharp eyes tracing the numbers. This wasn't a ripple or a wave anymore, it was a tide, and he'd unleashed it. He slipped on his jacket, his mind set. Tonight wasn't about watching, it was about acting. On West 46th Street, Luke Rivera slumped against a brick wall, his guitar silent for the first time in hours. The coffee cup was gone, replaced by a plastic bucket someone had shoved at him, overflowing with bills and coins, $87 and counting. The crowd had thinned after dusk, but stragglers lingered, phones out, voices loud. Street bard. One more. Luke's hands shook, his duct-taped jacket soaked from a brief rain, his eyes hollow. He played until his fingers bled, the melody, his mom's song, now a chain around his neck. Fame? This wasn't fame. This was a cage, and he didn't know how to break free. Barron stepped out of Trump Tower, James and Mike at his heels, their steps clipped and purposeful. Ethan's latest text burned in his pocket. 400K views. GoFundMe's at $15,000. People are calling him a legend. You in or what? Barron didn't reply. He wasn't in it for the spotlight, never had been. His father built empires with his name in lights. Barron built this with shadows and silence. He turned onto W46th, the street quieter now, the chaos of the day settling into an uneasy hum. Luke was there, slumped, broken, but there, under the street lamp, a bucket of money at his feet like a cruel joke. Luke stared at the cash, his breath ragged. $87, more than he'd seen in years, yet he felt poorer than ever. The crowd's chants echoed in his head. Street bard. Street bard. And his stomach churned. He'd seen the YouTube video now, a stranger's phone thrust in his face hours ago, his own gaunt reflection staring back. Luke the street bard. They called him, but he didn't recognize that kid, not anymore. His mom's voice whispered, "You're gonna make it." But this didn't feel like making it. It felt like falling apart. He clutched the guitar, his only anchor, and wondered who'd done this, who'd turned his pain into a spectacle. Barron stopped across the street, his hood up, his tall frame blending into the shadows. The crowd was down to a handful, 5, maybe 6 people, still filming, still gawking. Luke looked worse than yesterday, pale, trembling, like the weight of it all had crushed him. Barron's chest tightened. This wasn't the plan, not chaos, not collapse. He'd wanted the music heard, not the kid destroyed. James murmured, "Sir, we can leave." Barron cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "No. I need to talk to him." Mike tensed, but Barron stepped forward, the agents parting the stragglers with quiet authority. Luke's head jerked up at the sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, cutting through the murmurs. He saw him then, the tall kid, the one from that first night, his hood low but his eyes unmistakable. Barron. Luke's breath hitched, recognition slamming into him like a fist. "You," he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible over the wind. Barron stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his face calm but unreadable. The crowd hushed, phones still up, sensing something shift. "Me," Barron said simply, his tone low, steady, like he'd been waiting for this. Luke staggered to his feet, the guitar slipping to the pavement with a dull thud. "You did this?" he demanded, his voice cracking, anger and confusion spilling out. "The video, YouTube, all of this?" Barron nodded, unflinching. "Yeah. I did." Luke's fist clenched, his chapped hands stinging. "Why? What the hell do you want from me?" The crowd leaned in, filming, whispering, but Barron didn't blink. "I heard you," he said, his words deliberate. "That first night. You're good, better than good. People needed to hear it too." Luke laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the bricks. "Hear it? They're not hearing me, they're tearing me apart." He gestured at the bucket, the money spilling over, his voice rising. "This isn't me. I didn't ask for this." Barron's eyes softened, just a flicker, but he didn't back down. "You didn't have to," he said. "You were playing for nothing, now it's something." Luke shook his head, dizzy, his legs weak. "Something? This ain't something, it's a damn circus. Who are you anyway?" Barron paused, the question hanging between them. The crowd held its breath, phones trembling in their hands. "Doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "What matters is you've got a shot now. Money. People listening. Use it." Luke stared at him, his chest heaving, words failing. "A shot?" he spat. "I don't even know what I'm shooting for anymore." Barron stepped closer, his shadow falling over Luke, his tone dropping lower. "Then figure it out. You're not invisible now." Luke's knees buckled, and he sank back against the wall, the bucket tipping, coins scattering. $87 turned to $85 as a bill blew away, but he didn't care. "Invisible," he muttered, his eyes locking on Barron's. "I was fine being invisible. You took that." Barron crouched, leveling with him, his voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't fine. You were dying out here." Luke flinched, the truth cutting deeper than the cold. He thought of his mom, her last words, "Make it," and his throat closed. The crowd pressed in, a voice shouting, "Who's that guy?" James and Mike stepped forward, a silent wall, but Barron ignored them. He pulled a card from his pocket, plain, no name, just a number, and pressed it into Luke's hand. "When you're ready," he said, standing. "Call." Luke stared at the card, his fingers trembling, then up at Barron. "Why me?" he whispered, barely audible. Barron's lips twitched, not a smile, but close. "Because I heard you." Barron turned, walking away, James and Mike closing ranks behind him. The crowd parted, filming, buzzing, but he didn't look back. Luke clutched the card, his breath ragged, the melody echoing in his head. $85 on the ground, thousands online, and a stranger who'd changed everything. He didn't know what to do, didn't know if he could, but for the first time in years, he felt the weight of a choice. Barron's phone buzzed as he rounded the corner. "Ethan. 500K views. This is insane, what's next?" Barron didn't answer. He'd faced Luke, given him a lifeline. Now it was up to him. The street bard wasn't just a name anymore, it was a chance. And Barron, slipping back into the shadows, knew he'd lit the spark. What came next was Luke's fire to carry. The Manhattan dawn broke cold and gray, a thin mist curling through the streets like a ghost of the night before. Luke Rivera sat on a bench near West 46th Street, his guitar propped beside him, the plastic bucket of cash, $1.92 after last night's chaos, tucked under his arm. His duct-tape jacket hung loose, soaked and frayed, but he barely felt the chill. In his hand, he clutched the plain card Barron had given him. No name, just a number scratched in black ink. His fingers trembled as he turned it over, the weight of it heavier than the money. Fame had crashed into him, YouTube crowds, the street bard. But this card was something else. A choice. And Luke hadn't made a real choice in years. Up in Trump Tower, Barron Trump stood by his window, the city sprawling below in a muted haze. His phone sat silent on the desk, no new text from Ethan, no buzz of updates. The video had hit 620,000 views overnight, The GoFundMe climbing past $20,000. Comments still pouring in. Luke's a legend. Street bar needs a stage. Barron didn't check them. Not today. He'd done what he set out to do. The kid's music was heard. His life shifted. Now it was up to Luke. Barron pulled on a sweater, his movements slow, deliberate. His father's voice lingered. You move the pieces, then you let them fall. He'd moved the pieces. Now he'd wait. Luke stared at the card, his breath fighting in the damp air. The crowd was gone. W46 was quiet now, just the hum of early traffic and a distant siren. But the echo stayed. Play it again, Bard. You're famous. He'd seen the video, heard his mom's song through a stranger's phone, watched his own hollow face play back like a ghost. $92 in a bucket, $20,000 online, numbers that didn't make sense. He thought of his mom, her last whisper. You're gonna make it, Lucas. Was this it? He didn't feel made, just lost, drowning in a storm he hadn't asked for. But that tall kid, Barron, had said, You're not invisible now. Luke's chest ached. Invisible had been safe. This was anything but. He pulled a borrowed phone from his pocket. A guy from last night's crowd had lent it, grinning. For the street bar. Luke hadn't wanted it, but he'd taken it, the card burning a hole in his hand. He dialed the number, each beep loud in the morning stillness. It rang twice, then a voice, deep, calm, familiar. Yeah? Luke's throat tightened, words sticking. It's me, he rasped. Look. A pause, then Barron's voice, steady as ever. Good. You called. Luke gripped the phone, his knuckles white. What do you want from me? He demanded, quieter this time, less anger, more exhaustion. Barron stood by his desk, the phone pressed to his ear. He'd expected this, hoped for it. Nothing, he said, his tone even. It's what you want now. The money's there, GoFundMe, the bucket. People are listening. What's your move? Luke laughed, a dry, broken sound. My move? I don't even know who I am anymore. Barron didn't flinch. You're Luke. You play. That's enough to start. Luke's breath hitched, the words cutting through the fog. Start what? He muttered. I've got nothing, nobody. Barron's voice softened, just a shade. You've got the music. And you've got a shot. Use it. Luke sank back on the bench, the phone slipping in his sweaty grip. A shot, he echoed, his mind spinning. He saw his mom smile, heard her song, his song, now the world's. $92 could buy strings, food, a night off the street. $20,000 could buy, what? A studio? A life? He didn't know, hadn't dreamed that big since Jersey. Why'd you do this? He asked, his voice small. Barron paused, the city's hum filling the silence. Because I heard you, he said, same as last night, but heavier now. And you deserve to be heard. Luke's eyes burned, not tears, not yet, just the sting of something waking up. Barron hung up, setting the phone down. He didn't need to say more. The kid had the card, the cash, the choice. He crossed to the window, staring out at the streets below. Ethan's channel was at 650,000 views now, the GoFundMe nearing $25,000. Luke's name, Luke Rivera, was everywhere. The street barred. A story people couldn't stop telling. Barron's lips twitched, not a smile, but close. His father built with noise and gold. Barron built with this, quiet, unseen, but real. He'd stepped back now, his part done. The rest was Luke's. Luke sat there, the phone dead in his hand, the card crumpled in his fist. He looked at the bucket, $92, then at the guitar, its scratched wood glinting in the dawn. A shot, he whispered, testing the words. He thought of his mom, her frail hands, her faith. He thought of the tall kid, Barron, whose voice carried a strange certainty. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if he could, but for the first time in years, he wanted to try. He picked up the guitar, his fingers brushing the strings, and a single note slipped out, soft, shaky, but his. The city woke around him, cabs honking, footsteps quickening, but Luke didn't move. He played quietly, just for himself, the melody that started it all. $92 wasn't much. $25,000 was a dream, but it was more than yesterday. More than nothing. He didn't know where Barron was, didn't know his name, not really, but he felt him, a shadow that had pulled him into the light. Luke's hands steadied, the music rising, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. Barron watched the skyline, the mist lifting, the city sharpening into focus. His phone stayed silent. He didn't need updates. Luke had called. Luke would choose. The Street Bard wasn't just a viral hit now. He was a story, a spark, a chance. Barron turned away from the window, his work done. Whatever Luke built next, it was his to shape. The Manhattan sky burned orange as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a warm glow over the city's jagged edges. Luke Rivera stood on the corner of West 46th Street, his guitar slung over his shoulder, a new black case strapped to his back, bought with $50 from the bucket, now down to $42. His duct tape jacket was gone, traded for a thrift store coat that actually fit, the rest of the cash tucked into a pocket he'd sewn himself. The GoFundMe had hit $30,000, money he hadn't touched yet, wired to a cheap prepaid card a stranger had helped him set up. Luke's hands still shook, but not from cold, not anymore. They shook with something else, purpose, fragile but growing. Up in Trump Tower, Barron Trump leaned against his bedroom window, the city's lights flickering on below. His phone sat on the desk, Ethan's last text unanswered. 1M views. Street Bard's a myth now, where you at? Barron didn't need to reply. The video had done its work, 1.2 million views, $35,000 in donations. Luke's name whispered everywhere. He'd seen the latest clips online, Luke playing again, not on a sidewalk, but somewhere new. Barron's lips twitched, not a full smile, but enough. His father built empires with noise. Barron had built this with silence, and it was enough. Luke adjusted the guitar strap, his breath steady in the crisp evening air. He'd spent the day moving, off the street, into a $20 a night hostel a few blocks away, the first bed he'd had in years. The prepaid card held the GoFundMe funds, and he'd stared at it for hours, the numbers unreal. $30,000, a fortune he couldn't grasp. He'd bought the guitar case, the coat, a hot meal, small steps, but his. The card from that tall kid, Barron, sat in his pocket, crumpled but unthrown. Luke didn't know his name, not fully, but he knew his voice, his shadow, the push that had pulled him here. He'd heard whispers all day, people passing saying, "That's him, the Street Bard." A bodega clerk had played the YouTube video, grinning. "You're famous, man." Luke hadn't run this time. He nodded, mumbled a "thanks," and kept walking. Fame still felt like a weight, but it was lighter now, less a cage, more a door. He stopped at a small plaza near 8th Avenue, a patch of open concrete where buskers sometimes played. No crowd yet, just a few stragglers, but Luke didn't care. He set the case down, opened it, and lifted his guitar, still battered, still his, and started to play. Barron stepped out of Trump Tower, James and Mike a quiet presence behind him. He didn't head to W46 this time. Luke wasn't there anymore, he'd seen that online. Instead, he walked toward 8th Avenue, drawn by a hunch, a pull he couldn't name. The city buzzed around him, cabs honking, voices overlapping, but he tuned it out, his hood up, his steps sure. He'd given Luke the spark, now he wanted to see the fire. His phone stayed silent, he didn't check the views, didn't need to. This wasn't about numbers anymore. Luke's fingers found the melody, his mom's song, the one that started it all. The notes rose, cleaner now, stronger, the new strings he'd bought singing under his touch. A few people slowed, then stopped, 5, then 10, a small crowd forming. No phones this time, just eyes, ears, listening. Luke kept his head down, the music spilling out like it used to, back in Jersey, back when it was just him and her. His mom's voice echoed. "You're gonna make it, Lucas." He hadn't made it, not the way she dreamed, but he was here, playing, alive. The crowd grew, 20 now, clapping softly, and Luke felt it, not fame, but something better. Himself. Barron turned onto 8th Avenue, the plaza coming into view. He saw him, Luke, standing tall, guitar in hand, the melody cutting through the evening chill. No bucket, no desperation, just music. Barron stopped, staying back, his shadow lost in the gathering dusk. James murmured, "Sir?" But Barron waved him off, his eyes locked on Luke. The kid looked different, straighter, steadier, like the weight had shifted. The crowd was small but real, listening, not gawking. Barron's chest loosened, a rare ease settling in. This was it, what he'd heard that first night, what he'd pushed for. Luke finished the song, the last note hanging in the air, met by quiet applause. He looked up, meeting their eyes, not running, not hiding. A woman tossed $1 into the open case, smiling. "Beautiful, street bard." Luke nodded, his voice low but clear. "Thanks. $1, not $92, not $35,000, but enough." He started again, a new melody this time, one he'd hummed in the hostel last night, rough but his. The crowd stayed, growing, 30 now, and Luke played, his fingers sure, his heart open. He didn't know where Barron was, didn't need to. The card was enough, the chance was enough. Barron watched for a moment longer, the music reaching him, soft but strong. Luke didn't see him, didn't need to. Barron had started this, but it wasn't his story anymore, it was Luke's. He turned away, James and Mike following, the melody fading behind him. His phone buzzed, Ethan probably, but he didn't check. The street bard was real now, not a viral hit, not a charity case, but a kid with a guitar and a future. Barron slipped into the city's flow, his hood low, his steps light. His father's voice faded, his own took its place. "You did this." Luke played on, the plaza filling, 50 people now, clapping, swaying. The case held $5, the prepaid card held thousands, but the music held him. He thought of his mom, her smile, her faith. He thought of the tall kid, the shadow who'd heard him when no one else had. "You're not invisible now," he'd said, and Luke wasn't, not anymore. The melody rose, his melody, and for the first time in years, he believed it, he could make it. Barron reached Trump Tower, the doors sliding shut behind him. He glanced back once, the city glowing, alive. Luke was out there, playing, building something. Barron climbed the elevator, alone now, the silence his own. The street bard's story was spreading, 1.2 million views, $35,000, a new start, and Barron had lit the match. He didn't need to see the fire grow, he knew it would. And that was enough.